Welcome back to Filling in the History. This is the amateur historian again. This is our 23rd episode. Today we're going to be talking about Doctrine and Covenants 58 and 59, along with some minutes to a meeting and the license of the bishop of the church at the time, Edward Partridge. So kind of fun stuff today. Definitely not as long as last episode, but thanks for sticking with us. Again, YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Go enjoy. This is looking at church history through the lens of the Joseph Smith papers specifically. These guys are right over here to my left. And we're going to be constraining our research to that and just kind of showing what we found in the Joseph Smith papers for these particular revelations. So we're going to dive into part one today. There's going to be 2 parts today, 4 documents total. The first thing that we're going to talk about is what we now call section 58 from the Doctrine and Covenants. The first version of this that we have is from Revelation Book 1, and it is in the handwriting of John Widmer. We get some verse numbering in the hand of W. W. Phelps for its publication in the Book of Commandments. And there are some corrections to the text, and this is where things get fun again. This is a little thing about reading this little teeny tiny details that I love. The last name additions that you see in the hand of Joseph Smith himself. For some reason, he wanted people to know exactly who was being spoken about. So that's what you get, last names for all these people in the hand of Joseph Smith Jr. Some additions in the hand of Sidney Rigdon, specifically this statement. It says, unto the church in Ohio to receive monies to purchase lands in Zion. So a little addition there, done a little later on before publication. This revelation is chapter 59 in the original Book of Commandments and section 18 in the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants. We also get a copy of this in the manuscript history, and we'll get into the introduction that the manuscript offers us here in a moment. What's really fun today, we also get this revelation in an anti-Mormon book called Mormonism Unveiled, which is written by Eber D. Howe. It was published in 1834, and the copy that we have is actually in the Church History Library. There is, some anti-Mormon tracts apparently that we hold in the Church History Library. So it's kind of fun. So there is an introduction for this revelation from Mormonism Unveiled. We'll get to that as well because it's all fair game. We don't really go for or against here. It's just the data that we have. And that's one of the things I really love about the Joseph Smith papers. So there you go. There are no differences of any kind, even to the dates from 1981 and the 2013 section headings. So if you read either version of those section headings that the church puts out, they're exact same wording. So there you go. So that's enough about the paper that we have, the papers that we get to read from. Some introductions here. The Revelation Book 1 gives us a lot of et ceteras. So hold on to your horses, et cetera, et cetera. It says 61st Commandment, August 1st, 1831. A revelation given to the elders who were assembled in on the land of Zion. Directions what to do, etc., etc., etc. There's a lot of et ceteras. Not much in contemporary published works for this, just kind of revelation given on August of 1831 from the Book of Commandments and the Doctrine and Covenants at the time. We do get this from Mormonism Unveiled. I don't know if anyone's ever read Mormonism Unveiled, but again, this is a work of literature that, as we say, is not in favor of the church. So it says this, quote, we have already given the reader a pretty fair view of this artful imposition, which may be considered all that is requisite to stamp it with infamy in the estimation of irrational minds. The preceding letters alone are amply sufficient to scatter the whole system of deception to the four winds, but we have yet many curious and rare documents in store. A few revelations will be here inserted as a specimen of the manner in which the prophet governs and rebukes his dupes. The first will show the means he employed to get over and obviate the contentions among them. On their first visit to Missouri, briefly alluded to by Mr. Booth, in this, the cloven foot is very prominent. I believe that is a reference to Satan. I believe the cloven foot is what that means. And Mr. Booth is referring to somebody named Ezra Booth. There you go. That is the Mormonism Unveiled version of an introduction, which I think is rather flowery in its insults. So, good for you. Manuscript history gives a different take on this revelation than what, Eber Howe did. It says this, The first Sabbath after our arrival in Jackson County, Missouri, Brother William W. Phelps preached to a Western audience over the boundary of the United States, wherein were present specimens of all the families of the earth, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and there were several of the Lamanites, or Indians, as descendants of Shem, quite a respectable number of Negroes as descendants of Ham, and the balance was made up of citizens of the surrounding country and fully represented them great progenitor Japheth, themselves as pioneers of the West. At this meeting, 2 were baptized, who had previously believed in the fullness of the gospel. During this week, the Colesville branch referred to in the latter portion of the last revelation, C note to be inserted, and Sidney Rigdon, Sidney Gilbert and his wife, and elders Isaac Morley and Ezra Booth arrived, and I also received the following. 1st of August, 1831, which was a Monday. Revelation given in Zion, August of 1831. Now, something about this I believe is still believed by some today, but there was a very prominent belief. Shem, Ham, and Japheth, if you do not know, are the 3 sons of Noah who built the ark and survived the flood. And the belief was, and perhaps still is by some, is that there are 3 races, and that these 3 races are descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. That's how we get the 3 races. And the idea here is that Shem, or some people call them Shemites or Semites, this is where anti-Semitism perhaps comes from in some circles, is the idea that these are sort of maybe, again, Hebrews, so to speak. So Genesis follows the line of Shem. That's where you get Abraham and Moses and so forth from that. Ham would be descendants. They would be considered maybe what we would call from the African continent, people with dark skin, things like that. And Japheth for some people would be either a mixture of Europe or maybe even Asia. So the idea that there are, how do they call it in the 1800s? I believe it was Caucasians, Mongoloids, and Negroids. What was another way that they described it. But anyway, that's what they're referring to here, are the 3 great races that would have stemmed from these sons of Noah. I don't know if this is believed in any circles anymore, but it was a very widely held thing for a very long time, and it's kind of mentioned here just to kind of give an example of what they mean there. So if you didn't know, that's what that's referring to. So that's what we get from all the contemporary stuff. So I actually kind of like Eberhau's, writing. Is actually a pretty good writer, very flowery language, kind of entertaining to read. So anyway, so that's Mormonism Unveiled, a little bit from the manuscript history. What the editors from Documents Volume 1 give us in their historical introduction. So we just got to notice that this was the land of Zion. People start coming over, right? They start moving in, and then you get this. Upon arriving in Jackson County, however, some of the elders expressed disappointment with what they found. Oliver Cowdery, Ziba Peterson, Peter Whitmer Jr., and Frederick G. Williams had been preaching to white settlers in Independence and the vicinities since they were ejected from Indian Territory west of Missouri by February 1831. Despite their efforts, those arriving in Missouri in July found fewer than 10 converts, whereas some had expected a burgeoning community of believers and perhaps a settlement that would soon be able to accommodate the migration of church members. Further to this, meanwhile, tension arose between Bishop Edward Partridge and Joseph Smith. The revelation of 20th of July called Partridge to manage the property of the church and, quote, see to all things as it shall be appointed, unquote, by God's laws. With the assistance of Sidney Gilbert, who had been appointed an agent unto the church to buy lands, according to one observer, Partridge argued with Joseph Smith about the quality of the lands selected for purchase. The disagreement apparently generated hard feelings on both sides. Partridge considered Joseph Smith abusive, while Sidney Rigdon accused Partridge of having insulted the Lord's prophet. So, a little bit of infighting here, which led to this revelation. So we get this further in the historical introduction. In the wake of this incident, and faced with the daunting prospect of actually building the city of Zion, Joseph Smith dictated this 1st August revelation, probably at Independence, after addressing the, quote, unbelief and blindness of heart, unquote, of Partridge and others. The revelation gave further directions for the establishment of Zion, as had been promised in the 20th July revelation. The revelation instructed Joseph Smith to return to Ohio, directed those appointed to build up Zion to take the initiative in moving their families to Missouri, and encouraged the elders to look beyond the land's undeveloped condition and focus on its prophesied glory. The revelation also anticipated a major migration to Jackson County and provided information about the key roles that the bishop and the agent would play in regulating that migration by making known from time to time the privileges of the lands or the number of individuals that the church community could accommodate. Conferences of elders were to help control the migration as well, providing counsel on who should move. Okay. So, there's a lot of very practical things going on here, and apparently Joseph uh, well, the prophet and the bishop of the church, Edward Partridge, got into a bit of a fight over this, and apparently Joseph Smith is reported to be a little abusive about it. So, from footnote 3 to this introduction that we have, we get, according to Ezra Booth, the arriving elders expected to find a large church, which Smith said was revealed to him in a vision Oliver had raised up there. Instead, they found a congregation consisting of only 3 or 4 females. For Booth, who left the church in fall of 1831, this disappointment was difficult to overcome. Apparently, 7 people had actually been baptized in Jackson County by this time, including Joshua Lewis and other members of his family. So the idea that Joseph Smith had this revelation of like, or this vision that, there's all these people and Oliver's done all this stuff and they show up and there's like maybe 10, maybe 7. And so that was very hard for Ezra Booth. He wound up leaving the church, and he, again, is the person referred to in Mormonism Unveiled with Eberhau writing. So I guess an early leaver of the church. They would have called them apostates back then, but somebody who left the church. So yeah. There you go. A little bit of a disappointment there. So a little bit on content and footnotes that we get. From the words of the text, we get this. Quote, "My servant Edward Partridge, and appointed him his mission in this land. But if he repent not of his sins, which is unbelief and blindness of heart, let him take heed, lest he fall." And footnote 11 to this. On the 5th of August, 1831, a few days after this revelation was dictated, Partridge wrote a letter to his wife Lydia, wondering if he would be able to fulfill his station as bishop, quote, "to the acceptance of my heavenly Father," and asked her to pray for me that I may not fall. So this, again, it looks like a very stressful time in the life of Edward Partridge, who was getting maybe a little bit berated by the prophet and then felt a little under it since then. So having a difficult time here in Independence. It was not a sort of a happy meeting, I guess is the point that I'm making here. Further down in the Revelation we get, "Behold, his mission is given unto him, and it shall not be given again. And whoso standeth in that mission is appointed to be a judge in Israel, like as it was in ancient days, to divide the lands of the heritage of God unto his children, and to judge his people by the testimony of the just, and by the assistance of his counselors according to the laws of the kingdom which are given by the prophets of God. For verily I say unto you, my laws shall be kept on this land." Footnote 12 to this says, these counselors were Isaac Morley and John Corrill, who were, quote, "ordained assistants to the bishop," unquote, at the June 1831 conference. In referring to Bishop Partridge as a judge and his assistants as counselors, the revelation parallels Isaiah chapter 1, verse 26, which says, "I will restore thy judges as at the first, and thy counselors as at the beginning." And here you would have, once again, what I would consider to be the first presiding bishopric of the church. Now, what's interesting about current bishoprics, so on a ward level, they are definitely called judges in Zion. They sort of they will hear confessions, they will hold church courts. They have that sort of call to be a judge in that little area that they're in. Their ward boundaries, their ward members that they have there. I am not aware of the presiding bishop of the church having that kind of call. I think it's definitely implied that they do it. But the bishops on that level, at the general level, the presiding bishopric of the church, definitely has much more to do with the church-wide temporal affairs. So this calling, there are many bishops and different types of bishops, as I've talked about already. I think they kind of take on more or less of this one more heavily than the other. But anyway, it began here with Edward Partridge and Isaac Morley and John Quarles, who were his counselors. Even further down into the revelation we get, behold, here is wisdom. And now as I spoke concerning my servant Edward, this land is the land of his residence, and those whom he has appointed for his counselors, and also the land of the residence of him whom I have appointed to keep my storehouse. Wherefore let them bring their families to this land, as they shall counsel between them and me. And footnote 7 to this says, when he began his journey to Missouri, Partridge apparently did not anticipate that he would be asked to stay there. In a letter to his wife, Partridge wrote, quote, when I left Painesville, I told people I was coming back and bid no one a farewell, but for a short time, unquote. Eesh. And I get the feeling this kind of thing and sentiment was probably shared by others, where they're like, yeah, I really didn't, I thought I was coming back, and then never did. As another example to this, I've already said this a few times, but Oliver Cowdery and his crew go on a mission, and they don't even know that the church has moved to Kirtland while they're on their mission. There's, text messaging ain't so much a thing back then. Anyway, so there's that. Further down in the Revelation again, the text states, wherefore he receiveth no reward. Verily I say, men should be anxiously engaged in a good cause, and do many things of their own free will, and bring to pass much righteousness, for the power is in them, wherein they are agents unto themselves. And inasmuch as men are good, they shall in no wise lose their reward. And this is a very famous scripture in our time, where we talk about, being anxiously engaged in a good cause. This was actually a recent teaching that was revealed in the Joseph Smith translation of the Old Testament. So footnote 21 gives us this. Joseph Smith's revision of the book of Genesis, completed in early 1831, included God's instruction to Adam that all men are agents unto themselves. And this, I think, just in the secular world, is definitely accepted. But at the time, this idea that actually God gives man their ability to choose, there's not predestination and so forth. That was what the Revelation was implying from this translation of the book of Genesis. And so there's, anyway, it's one of those things where it's kind of new to them. It's something that's pretty well known today, and having free will and making your own decisions has definitely been a very popular thing, especially through the 20th century. But that was apparently kind of a new thing back in this time. Martin Harris was asked to consecrate. So even further into this revelation we get, I give unto you further directions concerning this land. It is wisdom in me that my servant Martin Harris should be an example unto the church in laying his money before the bishop of the church. He is called specifically, it's like, take cash, give it to the bishop, show everybody how it's done. But Martin might not have had anything to consecrate, since the Book of Mormon mortgage story in issue. So footnote 24 gives us this. Harris's son claimed in 1875 that Harris gave $1,200 to Partridge for land purchases in Missouri. But no extant contemporary sources corroborate that claim. Indeed, it is unclear what resources Harris had available in August of 1831. He had earlier mortgaged his farm to pay for the publication of the Book of Mormon, which apparently left him with no property to consecrate. However, according to a January 1830 agreement, Harris would have, quote, equal privilege to sell copies of the Book of Mormon until he was reimbursed for the $3,000 value of his farm. What money he gained from that is unclear, but Harris later recollected that he eventually received from Joseph Smith, quote, all that I advanced and more too, unquote. So he might not have had any money. They just basically, what the editors are saying here is they may not have had any sort of, they have no proof that he ever actually fulfilled this portion of that revelation. The revelation also reads, and also this is a law unto every man that cometh unto the land to receive an inheritance. and he shall do with his monies according as the law directs. And so what's implied here is that money is separate from property. And this might be a pretty big revelation for those who understand or think they understand the law of consecration. And in this case, this is a very interesting footnote 25 says, according to the 9th of February, 1831 revelation of the laws of the Church of Christ, any consecrated properties remaining after one received back a stewardship for his or her needs would be used, quote, for the purchase of purchasing land and building up of the New Jerusalem, unquote. The revelation referred only to properties and did not specify a separate instruction for monies. Take that as you will, but I think that's very, very interesting that, and as I read through the Doctrine and Covenants yet again, it's definitely very clear on a difference between money and property if you think about it. Those two statements are not interchangeable, money and property, which is a strange thing in 20th century America because we have a Federal Reserve note and money is a very common denominator for valuation of anything. But back then, again, money was kind of here and there because every bank had its own version of money. So property was the big thing. So I find it interesting that this revelation does make a difference between the two. So some people think consecration is you just pile all your money in the middle of the road and everybody takes what they want. That's apparently not the case, according to this footnote, which I think is very, very interesting. The text also gives us, now verily I say concerning the residue of the elders of my church, the time has not yet come for many years for them to receive their inheritance in this land, except they desire it through prayer, only as it shall be appointed unto them. For, behold, they shall push the people together from the ends of the earth. Wherefore assemble yourselves together, and he that is not appointed to stay in this land, let them preach the gospel in the regions round about, and after that, let them return to their homes, let them preach by the way. Footnote 31 to this. Apparently not all elders were appointed to move to Missouri at this time. Later in this revelation, the elders were told to supervise the gathering, while a later revelation clarified that Joseph Smith would have power, that he shall be enabled to discern by the Spirit those who shall go up unto the land of Zion, and those of my disciples that shall tarry. Okay. Just again, a kind of a different take on what these people were actually to be doing. Then we get this a command specifically to Sidney Rigdon. It says, I give unto my servant Sidney Rigdon a commandment that he shall write a description of the land of Zion and a statement of the will of God as it shall be made known by the Spirit unto him. So footnote 36 to this says, a later Joseph Smith history recounts that after this revelation's dictation, quote, we sought for all the information necessary to compose a description of the land of Zion. However, the description that Rigdon composed was not acceptable because he had, quote, received not counsel, but grieved the Spirit, unquote. A 30th of August, 1831 revelation instructed him to try again, warning that, quote, if the Lord receive it not, behold, he standeth no longer in the office which he hath appointed him. His second attempt was apparently accepted. That was a close one. Write your descriptions well, apparently. That was a pretty big deal. The Revelation also gives us, and let my servant Sidney consecrate and dedicate this land and the spot of the temple unto the Lord. And footnote 45 clarifies this. On the 2nd of August in Caw Township, Missouri, Rigdon, quote, consecrated and dedicated the land for the gathering of the saints. On the 3rd of August, Joseph Smith laid a cornerstone for the temple, and Rigdon pronounced the ground dedicated unto the Lord forever. And that is the Independence, Missouri Temple. So, or the temple lot, the temple grounds, if you will. Revelation is a chastisement to Ziba Peterson, and this gets, I kind of joked about this in a previous episode where Ziba might not have locked his heart on his mission. So here you go here. It says, quote, "Let that which has been bestowed upon Ziba Peterson be taken from him, and let him stand as a member in the church and labor with his own hands with the brethren until he is sufficiently chastened for all his sins, for he confesseth them not, and he thinketh to hide them." What are we talking about there? Footnote 51 says this: Peterson had traveled to Missouri with Oliver Cowdery, Peter Whitmer Jr., Parley P. Pratt, and Frederick G. Williams. Ezra Booth wrote that Whitmer and Williams had informed him that Peterson was guilty of conduct on a parallel with a man who enters into a matrimonial contract with a young lady and obtains the consent of her parents. But as soon as his back is turned upon her, he violates his engagements and prostitutes his honor by becoming the gallant of another, and resolves in his heart and expresses resolutions to marry her. Peterson confessed his transgression at the 4th of August conference, and a week later married Rebecca Hopper of Lafayette County, Missouri. So apparently he was kind of throwing himself at two women at the time, maybe making overtures to the intent of being married. Anyway, that turned into a pretty big problem, and he apparently confessed that that is what he did. So Ziba Peterson, man, you gotta lock your heart. Anyone going on a mission, you gotta lock your heart. Anyone being on a mission, you'll know what I mean by lock your heart. Anyway, we'll move on from that. Ziba has hopefully repented. The Revelation kind of concludes with us saying the gospel must be preached unto every creature with signs following them that believe, and behold, the Son of Man cometh. Amen. Footnote 56 to this from Documents Volume 1 says, regarding the closing words of this revelation, Ezra Booth wrote, "The elders of the church by commandment given in Missouri, and of which I was both an eye and ear witness, are to go forth to preach Mormonism to every creature. And now said Mr. Rigdon, quote, the Lord has set us our stint, no matter how soon we perform it, for when this is done, he will make his second appearance," unquote. Now, whether or not he said that is, again, we'll have to figure out. This is from Ezra Booth, who, again, later left the church, later in later in the fall of 1831. So there you go. That's section 58 of the Doctrine and Covenants. And we're going to do a quick minutes of the meetings, and then we'll be done with part 1. So this meeting was on the 4th of August, 1831. And this is found in Minute Book 2. So this is the handwriting of Ebenezer Robinson. And the historical introduction we get for this is, on the 4th of August, 1831, a group of elders convened that conference at the home of Joshua and Margaret Kelsey Lewis in Cott Township, about 8 miles west of Independence. The Lewises had been converted the previous winter by the missionaries sent to preach to the American Indians. And if you remember, this is a very, very small group of people that, when the saints arrived, that was it. Those were the converts that you had. So they had a conference in their home. So what's the content of it? Well, again, these conference minutes are short, so I'll just read them off to you. It says, the conference opened by singing glorious things, etc. I love how they use etc. Anyway, prayer by Brother Edward Partridge, exhortation to obedience to the requisition of heaven, by delivering a charge in the name of the Lord Christ to the bishop, rulers and members of the church planted in their inheritance in the land of Zion, by Brother Sidney Rigdon. Confession by Brother Ziba Peterson of his transgressions, which were satisfactory to the church, as appeared by unanimous vote. Exhortation by Brother Joseph Smith Jr. to acts of righteousness and keeping the commandments of the Lord with promise of blessings. 31 members present who, with the elders, partook of the sacrament, closed by prayer by Oliver Cowdery, clerk. Footnote 7 to this, we get about Ziba Peterson. At some point after this conference, Peterson was no longer allowed to function as an elder. He was reordained at an October 1832 conference. So for about a year, he lost his ability to be an elder in the church. Footnote 8 on the consecrated lands says, 3 days before this conference, a revelation expressed this same theme of blessings granted in return for obedience to commandments, and insisted that God's laws, quote, shall be kept on this land. John Whitmer wrote that on 2nd of August, 1831, Rigdon asked the saints, quote, "Do you pledge yourselves to keep the laws of God on this land, which you have never kept in your own land?" Unquote. When the saints voiced their assent, Rigdon pronounced the land consecrated and dedicated to the Lord for a possession and inheritance for the saints. That's how it was consecrated. Footnote 10 we get seems, it seems to be the start of a weekly sacrament service, so you get this. The Articles and Covenants instructed members to meet together oft to partake bread and wine in remembrance of the Lord Jesus. Although the offering of the Lord's Supper is not recorded in the minutes of earlier conferences, it probably occurred. For example, a later Joseph Smith history recounts that the sacrament was administered to the first conference held in June 1830. 3 days after this 4th of August 1831 conference, Joseph Smith dictated a revelation stating that those, quote, "whose feet stand upon this land of Zion," unquote, should go to the house of prayer and offer up sacraments upon my holy day, apparently prescribing the weekly observance of the Lord's Supper. And we're going to be getting into that in the next section. So this concept of like a weekly sacrament service and that the sacrament was going to be part of church, so to speak, kind of begins around here. So here we are in August of 1831. And as we will get to in the next part in section 59, that's when it's really formalized. Like, here's what you need to do on the Sabbath day, and how the sacrament relates to that and all of that jazz. So there you have it, section 58 in the minutes of a meeting. Ziva Peterson didn't lock his heart, stayed out of being an elder for about a year, came back. So glad he stuck with it. But that is it for part 1. Stay tuned for part 2 and 2 more documents, and then we'll be done for the day. Thanks. All right, lighting into part 2 already. We're going to be starting this with a license, actually, for Edward Partridge to be the bishop of the church. So basically, it is a piece of paper. And then we get into Doctrine and Covenants section 59, which, fun fact, is also just a piece of paper. We have an earlier copy than what we got out of Revelation Book 1. So the introduction into this license that we see. So again, I am taking my chronology from Documents Volume 1 of the Joseph Smith Papers series. So again, I know there may be other things out there, but what we're doing is constraining ourselves to the Joseph Smith Papers. And what we get here is a single piece of paper that was held in the Partridge family possession until sometime in the 1880s, when it came into the possession of the church historian's office, where it sits to this day. So here you have it. The handwriting is of Sidney Rigdon. And you have the signatures of Joseph Smith, Rigdon, and several others. And we'll get to that in a moment. But there are a lot of people on this. This is not a normal license. It's kind of termed that because that's how it was referred to. But this is very much different than any other licenses than we see from this time period because of all these signatures and other things that are in there. If you flip over the page, you can see it was kind of folded into something you could carry with you like a letter. And it simply says Bishop's License, and the number is 1831. And those are in Edward Partridge's handwriting. So apparently this was written out and then, it was kind of passed around, and I'll get to that in a moment as well. So what is the content of a license? Well, I'll just read it to you again, very brief. It says, "The Church of Jesus Christ, to all whom these presents may come, hereby testifieth that our brother Edward Partridge has been appointed bishop of this church on the 4th of February, 1831, with and by the consent of the whole church, agreeable to the appointment of God, and ordained to this office under the hand of Sidney Rigdon, an elder of this Church of Christ, regularly organized on the 6th of April, 1830, in witness whereof we have hereunto set our hands." And then you get several signatures, as you can see. That's the license. So just letting everybody know, Ed's legit, and so he can do the things that he does. And I would imagine that this would be very important when it came to like, I'm buying lands in the name of the church. You would definitely need to have some sort of a proof that you weren't making that up, right? So I think a very, very logical thing to do. So from the historical introduction to Documents Volume 1, we get this. This document provided such authority, but its wording, especially its designation, is coming from the church itself, does not follow the language of other extant early licenses, including a December 1830 license signifying that Partridge was an elder in the church, meaning even his own other license is different. Other early licenses were signed either by Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery as the first and second elders of the church, respectively, or by those who performed the ordination to the office. But this document was eventually signed by 20 elders, many of whom did not add their signatures until months after Partridge's appointment as bishop. The format of the signatures on the page, in two distinct columns with an empty third one between, suggests that it may have been intended that even more elders would sign the document. And so we really don't know the full reason why this document was made. So further into the historical introduction here, it says, Ezra Booth, who traveled to Missouri at this time, later stated that, quote, a commandment had instructed Cowdery and others to procure a written recommendation signed by the elders for the purpose of presenting it to the Indian agent in order to obtain permission from him to visit the Indians in their settlements, unquote. Whether Cowdery's recommend or the other recommends mentioned in this revelation were related to that purpose is not clear. But Booth's reference to a recommend signed by the elders suggests something similar to Partridge's document. Partridge was responsible for land purchases in Missouri, and the recommend from the church may have been intended to facilitate his transaction of business on behalf of the church. Neither the document itself nor other contemporaneous documents speak of its original purpose. So again, we don't really know exactly what this is for. But I think what the editors are saying and kind of what I'm saying is, again, like, hey, I'm here to buy a farm in the name of some organization. You're going to need some paperwork to show that you're legit, right? So I think that makes sense. Whether it's true or not, I guess we won't know. We filled up as much history as we can. So the signatures were gained over the following year. And the latest that we have, from the time it was received until all the signatures was late January 1832. So this is months in the process, and that was John Whitmer's when he reached Missouri. Footnote 5 to this says, Partridge was appointed bishop by a 4th February 1831 revelation. Not all of the signatories, were even members of the church in February 1831. Neither William W. Phelps nor William E. McClellan, for example, was baptized until summer of 1831. Kind of an interesting footnote there. And there you have it, a license to go bishop. Let's go bishop some stuff. That's what Edward Partridge had, signed by a lot of people. So there you go, kind of a brief one there. Then we're going to light into what we now know as section 59 of the Doctrine and Covenants. So what we get, a first copy of this is actually on a loose piece of paper from the Newell K. Whitney Papers, which is now held at the Harold B. Lee Library at BYU, at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. It is titled, How to Spend the Day Called Sunday, etc., etc., etc. How to Spend the Day Called Sunday. That is one of the best intros I've had so far on this show. The handwriting is of Oliver Cowdery. The Whitney Papers were actually held by that family until Mary Jane Whitney married somebody by the name of Isaac Grew. And it passed in the Grew family until it was donated to the BYU Library sometime between, or I think it was probably a process between 1969 and 1974. We also get a copy found in Revelation Book 1, of course. Text corrections from this and the handwriting itself in the name of John Whitmer. So there's some big strikeouts here and whatnot, but that's all in John Whitmer's hand, kind of correcting himself. And of course, there's verse numbering for publication in the Book of Commandments. So there you go. We also get a copy of this in what's called the Hyde and Smith Notebook. And this is referring to Orson Hyde and Samuel Smith, by the way. And so the handwriting you're seeing here is actually the handwriting of Samuel Smith from a notebook that they had. We also get a copy in the Evening and Morning Star. This one was actually published in July of 1832, so this is a little ways later on. But But yeah, it was actually published here right after what would be known now as the Law of the Church, or I believe that's section 42, or is it section 46? I forget off the top of my head. But anyway, those two things are kind of put together. It is chapter 60 in the Book of Commandments, and it is section 19 in the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants. I also found this guy. This is called a broadside, and this was printed in Kirtland. So this would be akin to a periodical, and we still have it. It is found in the Church History Library. So no introduction on this thing. It's just the revelation as it stands, but it's called a broadside. It is the only thing on the page. And so we still have that in our archives in Salt Lake City. There is a copy of this in the manuscript history of the church. And there are some pretty significant differences between the current section headings that we have. So again, from the 1981 publication of the Doctrine and Covenants, the section heading says this: preceding this record of this revelation, the prophet writes descriptively of the land of Zion, wherein the people were to be assembled. The land was consecrated, as the Lord had directed, and the site of the future temple was dedicated. The Lord makes these commandments especially applicable to the saints in Zion, unquote. So there you have it. But the current scriptures, or anything post-2013, gives us this, which is quite different. It says, quote, preceding this revelation, the land was consecrated as the Lord had directed, and the site for the future temple was dedicated. On the day this revelation was received, Polly Knight, the wife of Joseph Knight Sr., died, the first church member to die in Zion. Early members characterized this revelation as instructing the saints how to keep the Sabbath and how to fast and pray. Polly Knight, the first saint to die in Zion. And if you forget, Joseph Knight Sr. was a very important force for good in terms of supporting Joseph Smith and the publication of the Book of Mormon. So a name to remember, Polly Knight and her husband, Joseph Knight Sr. So you'll see that mentioned here. We'll get to that in a moment. So some introductions to this revelation. This letter that we have, this piece of paper in the Newell K. Whitney, papers collection, if you will. The Oliver Cowdery letter that was written calls it How to Spend the Day, called Sunday, etc., etc. That introduction there is written in Newell K. Whitney's hand. The rest of the body of everything, the whole text, is written in the hand of Oliver Cowdery. Revelation Book 1 says this: 62nd Commandment given in Missouri Independence, Jackson County, August 7th, 1831. Instructing the saints how to keep the Sabbath and how to fast and pray, and what it was, etc., etc. Some dashes there. Man, they love etc. back then. They just can't get enough of it. Anyway, Hyde and Smith, their notebook gives a revelation given in the land of Zion. And y'all can copy-paste that into the Book of Commandments and Doctrine and Covenants. Pretty much the exact same thing, very brief. And we get nothing on the broadside, like I said before. It just lights right into the document, nothing for it. The Evening and Morning Star simply gives us commandment for keeping the Sabbath, etc. etc. Anyway. And it's given, like I said, it's interesting if you take a look at this page. It's right under, more or less, the law, as we have it there. So they were put together in that, what we would call newspaper, or the periodical that the church had put out. All right, the manuscript history gives us a lot more than this. So it says, on the 3rd day of August, I proceeded to dedicate the plot spot for the temple. A little west of Independence was dedicated in, and there were present of 8 men, among whom were myself, Sidney Rigdon, Edward Partridge, William W. Phelps, Oliver Cowdery, Martin Harris, and Joseph Coe. The 87th Psalm was read, and the scene was solemn and impressive. On the 4th, I attended the first conference in the land of Zion. It was held at the house of Brother Joshua Lewis in Caw Township, in the presence of the Colesville branch of the church. The Spirit of the Lord was there. On the 7th, I attended the funeral of Sister Polly Peck Knight, the wife of Joseph Knight Sr. This was the first death of the church in this land, and I can say a worthy member sleeps in Jesus till the resurrection. I also received the following revelation given in Zion, August of 1831. So very high praise for Polly Knight. And I'm sure there will be later for Joseph Knight Sr. because they were a massive influence on the success of the early church. So the 87th Psalm was read. It says this, a psalm or song for the sons of Korah. His foundation is in the holy mountains. The Lord loveth the gates of Zion more than all the dwellings of Jacob. Glorious things are spoken of thee, O city of God, Selah. I will make mention of Rahab and Babylon to them that know me. Behold, Philistia and Tyre and Ethiopia, this man was born there. And of Zion it shall be said, this and that man was born in her, and the highest himself shall establish her. The Lord shall count, when he writeth up the people, that this man was born there, Selah. As well the singers as the players on instruments shall be there. All my springs are in thee. So definitely referring to how wonderful it will be to say that you're from Zion, right? Again, the 87th Psalm from the Old Testament. So that was read off during this episode. So there you go. Now we're going to get into the historical introduction. This is from the editors of Documents, Volume 1. So at the time, and you're going to see a lot of this about, like, why are we talking about the Sabbath day and what gives about all this stuff that we're doing. So many of the inhabitants that were already there, so this is pre-Latter-day Saints showing up, were actually from the south of the United States. And many of them were probably evading the law. So it was a rough place to be in. And so we get a couple of descriptions here. It says, a later Joseph Smith history characterizes many of the residents as the, quote, basest of men, who had fled from the face of civilized society into the frontier country to escape the hand of justice in their midnight revels, their Sabbath breaking, horse racing, and gambling. A traveler to western Missouri in 1833 made a similar observation, stating that, quote, the only indication of it being Sunday in the area was the unusual gambling and noise and assemblies around taverns. I love that. Sabbath day observance, however, was an important component of worship to many members of the Church of Christ, perhaps because of the general non-observance of the Sabbath among the inhabitants of Jackson County. The 7th of August revelation emphasized the importance of keeping the Sabbath day holy, outlining the church members should do what church members should do on that day. These guidelines filled a void that neither the Articles and Covenants of the Church nor the February 1831 revelation giving the laws of the Church of Christ had addressed, thereby providing direction to those who would be building up the city of Zion without the benefit of Joseph Smith's in-person leadership. Therefore, I conclude, again, amateur historian, that the reason in the Evening and Morning Star that you have a law and then you have this one is they're kind of one. They're kind of like, okay, here's a law of the church, but then here's some stuff about how to do the Sabbath day. All very important if you're going to be a Latter-day Saint. So, my opinion, why they were put together. What do I know? Anyway, footnote 4 to this says, according to one history of independence, the first clerk of the circuit court even left the town because of the, quote, rough exterior and uncultivated manners of the people, unquote. So they, like, drove out a county court clerk. I think that's great. That's how bad it was here, perceptively. I don't know. Anyway, so kind of fun. Really rough and tumble. It's like the pirates from Peter Pan. Anyway, whatever. Not really the best place to live, let's just say. So continuing on, historical introduction. The revelation may have also been a response to the concerns of those who had gone to Missouri and felt daunted by the task of building up Zion in a region described by one observer as containing only, quote, 2 or 3 merchant stores and 15 or 20 dwelling houses built mostly of logs hewed on both sides. In fact, the writer Washington Irving, who traveled through Independence in 1832 on an expedition with federal Indian commissioners, also commented on the, quote, rougher and rougher life he encountered as he got closer to the town, while his traveling companion Charles Latrobe described Independence as full of promise, but containing nothing but a ragged congeries of 5 or 6 rough log huts, 2 or 3 clapboard houses, 2 or 3 so-called hotels, alias grog shops, and a few stores. Perhaps to encourage the saints in such conditions, the revelation promised the bounties of the earth to the church members and reminded them to express gratitude to God. So this is a pretty rough place, and you can imagine the saints coming here being like, "Wow, this is it," you know? Like, this is it. There's all these, like, lean-tos and huts, and people are crazy around here, and they're all evading the law and whatnot. And I imagine it's probably very similar to how the saints felt when they got to the Salt Lake Valley, and they saw there was one tree, and it was dead. So they were like, "This is the one," and again, they made it blossom, and it was a wonderful thing. So, anyway. So not maybe the best place to live at the time. So let's talk about Polly Knight for a little bit. The historical introduction gives us this about her. It says, the revelation assured heavenly rewards for the obedient who would die in Zion, prompted perhaps by the death on the morning of the 7th of August of Polly Peck Knight, the 57-year-old wife of Joseph Knight Sr. and a friend of Joseph Smith and his family. Polly Knight had traveled to Missouri with the Colesville Saints, but after falling ill, she became, quote, the first death in the church in this land. It is unclear whether this revelation was dictated before or after Joseph Smith was informed of her death. So yeah, she was 57 at the time, which I imagine for 1831 is a fairly healthy life for what life expectancy was back then. So the copy that we have, the copy that we're using, this original copy that we have, it says the copy featured here belonged to Newell K. Whitney and is also in Cowdery's handwriting. Whitney's copy may be the original, but is more likely a fair copy. It was likely made for him sometime after Cowdery returned to Ohio at the end of August. Around that same time, John Whitmer copied the Revelation into Revelation Book 1. That there are few differences between the two copies suggests that they were made around the same time or from the same copy. So they would call these rough notes or a rough copy, and then you would make a fair copy that wouldn't have all those sort of distinctions in it. And what I find interesting is the Revelation Book 1 version of this, again, very little of that. It's a very clean copy, if you will. So they were definitely working off of some other text. Footnote 2 to this states, this revelation may have resulted in part from a desire to know what rewards such individuals would obtain. The statement, quote, trouble me no more concerning this matter, which appears in the closing portion of the revelation, suggests that the revelation came as a response to inquiry on the part of Joseph Smith or others with him. What those are, we may not know. So let's get into the content and the footnotes here. So the revelation gives us, a little further in says it, and that thou mayest more fully keep thyself unspotted from the world, thou shalt go to the house of prayer and offer up thy sacraments upon my holy day. For verily this day is a day appointed unto you to rest from your labors and to pay thy devotions unto the Most High. Footnote 9 to this says, the Articles and Covenants previously instructed members to meet together oft to partake bread and wine in remembrance of the Lord Jesus. But this revelation appears to be the first time that partaking of the Lord's Supper is specifically associated with Sunday worship. So if you want to kind of trace that back, you will wind up in section 59 here. Further in, the text gives us, the beasts of the fields, and the fowls of the air, and that which climbeth upon the trees, and walketh upon the earth, yea, the herb and the good things which cometh of the earth, whether for food or for raiment, or for houses, or for barns, or for orchards, or for gardens, or for vineyards, yea, all things which cometh of the earth in the season thereof, is made for the benefit and the use of man, both to please the eye and to gladden the heart, yea, for food and for raiment, for taste and for smell, to strengthen the body and to enliven the soul. And it pleaseth God that he hath given all these things unto man, for unto this end were they made, to be used with judgment, not to excess, neither by extortion. So the footnote to this, footnote 13. A May 31 revelation explained that, quote, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the air and that which cometh of the earth is ordained for the use of man, for food and for raiment, and that he might have an abundance, unquote. After hearing reports in Kirtland, Ohio from those who had traveled to Missouri, Elizabeth Goodkin Marsh explained that common game in Missouri consisted of deer turkeys, prairie hens, rabbit, and gray squirrels. She also reported that the state had an abundance of wild plums, wild sweet grapes, mulberries, strawberries, raspberries, and blackberries. Hazelnut, hickory nuts, and etc. are too numerous to mention. So apparently, there was a lot to gain from the land that they were going in Missouri, and that's one of the reasons why apparently this was stated. Now, this is a very interesting, maybe, I don't know if this is unique to Latter day Saints, but this idea that, like, yeah, all the stuff in this earth is meant for the use of man, but you are not to use it by excess, and you are not to extort. And so there's definitely this, it's like you're not like the boss man and you could do whatever you want with it. Like, you are to use it with skill and to a specific purpose. So it's not just free for all. So this whole idea of like that Adam is the Lord of the earth and names the animals and so forth and so on, I think in many cases might have been taken a little too far. So it's interesting in this revelation kind of reins that in somewhat. So kind of an interesting footnote there. Oliver adds a notation at the very end of this, says, given by Joseph the translator and written by Oliver Cowdery, August 7, 1831, in the land of Zion. Footnote 14 to this says, this notation by Cowdery may have been part of the original manuscript, because Samuel Smith included this same notation in his copy. It is not, however, in the copy made by John Whitmer in Revelation Book 1, nor is it included in the version published in the July 1832 issue of the Evening and the Morning Star. And so that's how you get all that you get from, section 58 and 59. And that, my friends, concludes part 2 and concludes this episode. So we've got 4 documents here, some interesting things. Like I said, last episode that we had was really long with a bunch of stuff in it, but hopefully this was a little bit easier to palate. Some very interesting things, though. Where does Sabbath day and sacrament sort of come together and lock together? Something that we do today in the church. That is enumerated here. Also, I just find it interesting that they sort of showed up in Independence, and this was a rough joint with a lot of people they did not want to be associating with. And so, kind of a tension there. And later on in church history, you will know, like, these particular saints never built a temple in Independence. There is a temple in Independence, Missouri today, which is the Community of Christ, and it's a very gorgeous building. I have actually never been there myself, but it's very, very pretty. And there's some other offshoot groups that are there as well. And so that's what you have currently to this day. So a little bit about the early days of Independence, Missouri. So hope you've been enjoying it. We'll be continuing on with some more filling in the history later. I am the amateur historian saying, enjoy a really great week.